Why Britain fired the man who won the war. History rarely gives us moments as ironic as this one. A man celebrated as the savior of his nation, the unbreakable voice that carried Britain through its darkest nights, suddenly shown the door by the very people he rescued. Winston Churchill walked into the summer of 1945 as a global icon. He walked out of it unemployed. And here's the thing, his defeat wasn't some tiny margin. The British public handed him a political earthquake. So what really happened? Why did Britain fire the man who won the war? To understand that, you need to look past the victory parades and listen to a country that was cheering Churchill with one breath and demanding change with the next. A victory with a shadow behind it, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. London was a city that had survived fire, hunger, bombs, and fear. People poured into the streets like a burst dam, and at the center of it all was the bulldog himself, Winston Churchill, stepping out onto the Buckingham Palace balcony as thousands roared for him. His approval rating? A towering 83%. He was the man who stared down Hitler, the man whose speeches turned despair into defiance, the man the world expected to lead Britain into peace just as he had led it through war. Which makes what happened next even stranger. Barely 2 months later, the British public voted him out, not narrowly, a landslide defeat, and one so shocking that even Joseph Stalin didn't believe it when he heard the news during the Potsdam Conference. To Stalin, the idea that a democracy would kick out its own victorious leader was absurd. But the British people weren't acting on emotion. They were acting on memory. The war was over, but life was still hard on the surface. The country was celebrating. Underneath, people were exhausted. Britain emerged from the war with victory in hand but devastation at its feet. Cities were scarred by bombs. Millions of homes had been damaged or destroyed. Food and clothes were still rationed. The national debt had soared to more than 250% of GDP, the highest in British history. And to the average citizen, the future looked foggy, not triumphant. Now add another layer. Beyond the war years, people still remember the decade that came before it, the 1930s. Britain called them the Hungry 30s for a reason. Mass unemployment, poverty, neglected towns, and broken promises had convinced many that something fundamental in the old system was flawed. The Conservative Party had been in power for most of that period, and whether fair or not, people connected the hardship to them. So when soldiers came home from the war, when workers returned from factories, and when families looked at their bombed-out streets, they weren't asking who saved Britain in 1940. They were asking something different. Who will rebuild it now? The Beveridge Report, a blueprint that lit a fire. In 1942, while the war was still raging on multiple fronts and Britain faced nightly bombings, a government document emerged that quietly reshaped the country's political horizon. Authored by economist William Beveridge, it didn't describe military strategy or international diplomacy. Instead, it confronted the daily realities that had plagued British society long before the conflict began. Beveridge identified what he called the 5 giant evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, a set of structural failures that had defined the interwar years and left millions vulnerable. The report was not written as an abstract academic exercise. It was in essence a blueprint for a completely redesigned social order. Beveridge proposed a system in which the state accepted responsibility for providing citizens with economic security, healthcare, education, and dignified living conditions. This meant a comprehensive welfare structure that protected individuals from the cradle to the grave, an ambitious national health service available to every citizen, genuine commitments to full employment, large-scale housing development, and investment in human capital at a level Britain had never attempted before. At a time when resources were scarce and uncertainty was constant, the Beveridge Report struck a nerve. It captured the imagination of ordinary Britons because it dared to sketch a future worth surviving for. More than 600,000 copies were sold, an extraordinary number for a government publication in the midst of total war. People read it in bomb shelters, factories, barracks, and ration queues. It spoke to hopes that had been frustrated after the First World War, when promises of a land fit for heroes had faded into unemployment lines, slum housing, and stark inequality. For many, Beveridge did what Churchill could not. He laid out a coherent, optimistic vision of life after the fighting stopped. Churchill had given the nation courage, resilience, and leadership. Beveridge gave it an idea of what the peace might actually look like. That difference would matter. The Labour Party understood immediately what the report represented. They embraced it not as a distant wish list, but as the central pillar of their political identity. Labour leaders made it clear that rebuilding Britain required more than gratitude and nostalgia. It required structural reform. They turned the Beveridge proposals into an actionable mission, promising to eradicate the five giants, expand public services, and construct a society built on fairness, stability, and collective responsibility. Their manifesto for the 1945 election read like a continuation of the report itself. The Conservatives, including Churchill, responded more cautiously. They did not reject the report outright, but they questioned the timing and the cost. They argued that with the war still ongoing, especially with Japan still undefeated, Britain could not afford sweeping reforms. Their approach was one of postponement, first victory, then practicalities. To conservative leaders, caution seemed responsible. To millions of voters, it sounded familiar and uninspiring. And this is where the political shift became irreversible. After years of hardship, rationing, air raids, and loss, the public was not looking for patience. They were looking for transformation. Later felt like a euphemism for never, a return to the old economic order of the 1930s when promises had evaporated and communities had been left behind. In contrast, Labour was speaking the language of tomorrow. Their campaign offered not only change but a plan, one rooted in a report people had already embraced with rare enthusiasm. Churchill's campaign: brilliant history, weak future. When the July 1945 election was announced, Churchill and the Conservative Party put almost all their weight on one thing: his wartime heroism. Posters showed Churchill with the slogan, "Help him finish the job." But the job they highlighted was the war with Japan, not the broken homes, unemployment fears, or the welfare reforms voters cared about. Most people respected Churchill deeply, but they quietly wondered, is this the man for peace? Meanwhile, Labour was talking about jobs, homes, healthcare, opportunity, and rebuilding Britain from the ground up. Their manifesto was called "Let Us Face the Future." Perfect timing, perfect message. And their leaders weren't unknown names. Clement Attlee, quiet and calm, had been Churchill's deputy prime minister. Other Labour figures had run major wartime ministries, proving they knew how to manage the nation. For millions of ordinary Britons, the choice looked like this: Churchill, the hero of yesterday; Labour, the promise of tomorrow. And then Churchill made a mistake that sealed it. The Gestapo speech, a line that backfired. On June 4, 1945, Churchill delivered a radio speech warning that Labour's ideas could not be carried out without some form of Gestapo. He tried to paint socialism as a threat to freedom, but the timing was awful and the comparison was outrageous to a population that had just fought the real Gestapo. Many felt it was an insult, not just to Labour, but to their intelligence. Taking a shot at Clement Attlee, a mild-mannered man who had loyally supported him throughout the war, made Churchill look petty and out of touch. People respected him, but this was the first moment where many began to see him as a politician again, not the national father figure he had been during the war. Polling day. The vote that changed Britain forever. Voting took place on July 5th, but results were delayed for 3 weeks, so ballots from soldiers overseas could be counted. Churchill left for the Potsdam Conference during this wait, negotiating the post-war world with Truman and Stalin. Attlee went with him, even though they were opponents in the election, because Churchill still believed he would win. He had no idea what was coming. On July 26th, the results finally arrived, and they hit like a thunderclap. Labour won 393 seats. The Conservatives collapsed to 197, one of the biggest swings in British electoral history. When Churchill heard the outcome, he described it as a sharp stab of almost physical pain. His wife, Clementine, tried to comfort him by saying it might be a blessing in disguise. He answered, "At the moment, it seems very effectively disguised." He drove to Buckingham Palace, resigned, and minutes later, Attlee walked in and became Prime Minister. Was Britain ungrateful? Not even close. Here's the truth. The British people didn't fire Churchill because they disliked him. They fired the Conservatives because they feared the past more than they trusted nostalgia. They believed Churchill was the right man for war, but the wrong one for peace. Attlee and the Labour Party represented a new social contract, and the public seized it. And their gamble changed Britain forever. Within a few years, the Labour government created the National Health Service, expanded social housing, built the foundation of the modern welfare state, and set a tone for British society that lasted for decades. Churchill wasn't thrown out as a punishment. He was released from his wartime role so Britain could hire an architect to rebuild the nation. He won the war, but the British people were ready to win the peace.